Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about Africa and imperialism. But before imperialism comes about, I have to talk to you about what was happening long before that. So let's talk about Africa. We are beginning in the early 1800s. Now I'm going to leave the whiteboard and I'm going to go over to a map. Okay, so you got to understand these names of these countries, they're all pretty new. So we're not necessarily talking about the same names of countries. And I'm going to talk about regions. When I say South Africa, I'm not talking about this country down here, South Africa. I'm talking about the southern region. Okay, so in the early 1800s, the North, all this is mostly the Sahara Desert. Most of this was run by the Ottoman Empire, so it was all Islamic. The West, in the West, there was this huge Islamic revival, which means, they were Muslim, but nobody necessarily really took their religion all that seriously until this one guy, Usman Dafodio. Sorry, I have to write his name down for you because you should know this name. Usman Dafodio. So he was from here, like northern Nigeria. And he started this huge Muslim revival where he's got people really excited about the religion. And he started wanting to make laws for this region based on the Quran. That's Sharia law, Sharia law, depending on where you're from, whether they say Sharia or Sharia, but law. So he wanted to make the law of the government, the law of the land, based on law from the Muslim holy book. Then over here in the East, you had a whole bunch of slave trading going on. They were mostly selling their slaves over here. Now, there was also slave trading going on here. So one thing that's important, really, really important to know about world history is that the Europeans did not come to Africa and begin a slave trade. The Africans themselves already had a fierce slave trade going on. There would be wars, and whoever lost the war, they were captured and sold as slaves. Well, when the Europeans came over to Africa, they were like, hey, we want in on that slave trade. We'll buy your slaves from you. So they started buying slaves and shipping them over here from the West. And the East, they sold their slaves over here to Asia. All right, so the North was Ottoman Empire. The West, there was a big Muslim revival going on. The East was just getting rich and rich and rich and rich and rich from selling slaves. And down here in the South, so a long time ago, people from the Netherlands settled down here. And they're called, get my whiteboard open, Boer people. Boer. The Boer people from the Netherlands, that's up here, that's it right there, the Netherlands settled down here. And they were big time in the slave trade. Well, then people from England came down here and said, no, this is our land now. and they wanted to end the slave trade. Well, the Boer people were getting rich from selling slaves, so they didn't like that very much. There was lots of fighting, and the Boer people were pushed north. Well, when they were pushed north, they encountered the Zulu people. The Zulu were actual like African people. They were a tribal group that controlled a lot of this land. So now the Boers are fighting, they were fighting the English. They're running away from the English and moving further north. Then they're encountering the Zulus and they're having to fight with them. So lots of fighting going on down here in the south. The Zulus and the Boers fought pretty much constantly from the early 1800s all the way up until the turn of the century, which is when the 1900s began. They were constantly fighting over land. Let's see. So as Europe was going through ending the slave trade, it started in Britain, and then it kind of slowly, very, very slowly spread throughout Europe that the slave trade was ending. England did this thing where, you see this tiny little piece of land right here? They called it Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, and they made it for ex-slaves, people that had been captured in Africa and taken to Europe, or whose ancestors had been taken to Europe, because the slave trade went on for a really long time. And they made Sierra Leone, and they allowed freed slaves to move here and live in Africa again. At about the same time, a bunch of descendants of slaves from the Americas decided they wanted to go back to Africa, and they all settled here in a place called Liberia. Let's see. Liberia. The difference in the two places is England actually made Sierra Leone. Whoops, this is right here where it says Guinea. Then there's a smaller little place here, that's Sierra Leone. The British made Sierra Leone for the descendants of slaves and recent ex-slaves. No one made Liberia for American ex-slaves. They all just went and they settled in this place and they called it their own. In 1787, these ex-slaves and descendants of ex-slaves from the US, they called this place their own. They wrote up their own constitution and they founded the Republic of Liberia. All right. I am so sorry. I just misspoke to you. Please, I hope you're paying attention right now. It was 1787 that Sierra Leone was founded. Sorry. Everything I said was true. I just gave the wrong year. Sierra Leone was founded in 1787 and Liberia was in 1847. Quite a while after. So Liberia, these were the descendants of, well, they were ex-slaves and their descendants went from the US, went to Liberia. Sierra Leone was actually made by Britain for the ex-slaves. Okay, so at this time, there weren't really that many Europeans in Africa. the people and the Europeans that were there looked on the Africans with a very paternalistic view. I don't know if you know what paternalistic means, so I will teach you. Paternalistic means they kind of saw the Africans as children. They saw them as ignorant, poor little children, and they were there to save them. In modern day, like 2020, what these people would be called is they call themselves white saviors. People might have a white savior complex, which is when like white Europeans or Americans go to a place where people don't look just like them and try to save them and help them and give them a better life because their life is so bad and my life, because I'm white, is so much better, and I want to bring them my wonderful white lifestyle. Well, that's what they did. It was a very kind of arrogant approach to Africa of I'm here to save these poor people from their awful, awful lifestyle. I'm going to make everything better for them. And then in the 1860s and 70s, this guy, Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone, big name, know this name. This is an important name. Dr. David Livingstone was a European that did all kinds of African exploring. He was an explorer and a missionary. He was one of those people that thought that spreading the Christian faith to these horrible, horrible heathen Africans was going to help them. So he explored and he spread his faith. And he did all kinds of really, really cool exploring of inner Africa. Like, mostly the Europeans just stayed right along the coast, and he went into inner Africa. Well, after he did that, I'm going to erase that so I can have some space. In the 1880s, King Leopold II of Belgium went into the Congo, which is this area here. This is the DRC, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And up above it, this is Congo, but those are modern day names. At the time, all of this was just called the Congo. And he personally, I mean, it wasn't him. He sent people to do this for him, but he conquered this land. Have to be clear, it is not the government of Belgium. It was just him as an individual. Just like the president of Kazakhstan, whatever, he owns some things that are his own personal property. Everything he owns is not Kazakh. Well, that's what King Leopold did. He wasn't conquering this land for Belgium. He wasn't making it a Belgian colony. He took this stuff for himself. And he told the people, he said, oh, I feel so sorry for them and I want to make their life better. But it really wasn't true. What he wanted was to get rich. And he was horrible. He was a very, very cruel person to the Africans. His people that worked for him abused these people in so many ways. He beat them, he tortured them, he forced them to work. He enslaved like the entire region of Congo. It was horrible. People were dying left and right. And eventually, some like kind-hearted people from Europe started going, hey, it's not really right, dude. You shouldn't really treat people like that. And when the people got so upset with him, he ended up finally signing over his ownership of Congo to the Belgian government. So now all of this land is officially owned, if you can own land and own people, whatever, it's colonized, it's owned by Belgium. Well, when that happened, now that Belgium owns this huge chunk of land, what do you think happened in the rest of Europe? Yeah, everybody wanted a piece. So now Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, Britain, they're all rushing into Africa, and they all want pieces because they're like, oh, we're not going to have Belgium get ahead of us. We want some, and we're taking some. Then in 1884, wait, before I go on, this guy, remember, for the rest of your life, if you ever hear of Leopold II, remember he was a bad guy. Okay, now in 1884, these European countries came together and held the Berlin Conference. You guys are going to be so disgusted when you hear what the Berlin Conference is. So the Berlin Conference was when a bunch of European leaders got together and decided who owned what parts of Africa. Not one African person was at this conference. Not one. They didn't invite, it wasn't like they were invited and didn't show up. They didn't invite them. European leaders just got together and decided who owned what of an entire continent. So within 20 years, Europe owned almost all of Africa. The whole thing was controlled by Europe. And they made this rule. They said, you're not allowed to claim ownership unless you have an actual government office in that area. So these Europeans were setting up government offices to rule the land in Africa. Let's see. Sorry, I'm reading my notes to see what I need to say next. Okay, France. France got this huge area of Africa. France controlled so much of the continent of Africa, it was equal to the land of the entire United States of America. Okay, so look, let's see, I think I can have both. Here's France. Here's how small France is. Here's how huge the United States is. Now, if you could just pick up the United States and put it on top of Africa, that's how much of the African continent France controlled. Britain controlled a little bit in the west, a little bit in the east, and a whole lot in the south. And do you remember the war that I told you about that Britain and Britain and the Boer did? Britain and the Boer. Well, there was the Boer War was from 1899 to 1902. And that's when Britain and the Boer really went to war over who controls the southern part of Africa, and the British won. So the British won, and they pushed the Boer out. Portugal, Italy, and Germany also took some land in Africa. So now we're talking, it's about the year 1900, and Africa is like 99.99999999999% controlled by Europe. But then some Africans began to resist. Some Africans began to resist imperialism. And you know, imperialism is taking over the economy, politics, or culture of a land. So everything I just told you about Europe taking over, all of it was imperialism. So the Algerians were fighting the French. Here's Algeria. The Algerians were fighting the French. This guy, Samori Touré, was down here in the west, and he was leading huge rebellions. Let me give you his name. Okay, I'll write it all. Algeria was fighting France, and also Samori Touré in West Africa was fighting France. The Zulus, I talked to you about the Zulus earlier. The Zulus were like a really, really huge African tribe. They were fighting the British down here. And the Asante were another African tribe. They were fighting the British over here. Going back, don't worry, I'm going to write that down for you. The Zulus in the south and the Asante in the west, they were fighting the British. And the Yao and the Herero, these are tribes. They were fighting Germany in the east. Back to the map. Okay, so down here, you've got the here and here. You've got the Zulus fighting the British. You've got the Asante fighting the British. You've got Samori Touré fighting here, and all the west fighting the French. Algeria's fighting the French. And the Yao and the Herero are fighting the Germans over here. So there's like fighting kind of all over the whole continent. These are African peoples fighting off the Europeans because they're like, get out of here. We want our own culture. We want to rule ourselves. Get out of our nation. Now, this is a sad part. In 1905, the Germans won in the East. How did they do that? Do you guys remember when when Napoleon entered Russia? He was trying to conquer Russia because he wasn't friends with his buddy the Tsar anymore. And he entered with all those soldiers, and he lost, and he left with only a few soldiers. What was the big thing that made him lose? Well, there were two big things. One was the cold, and the other one was what? I'm going to wait for a minute because I want you to think about it. Right. When the Russian soldiers left, they burned all the fields. They burned everything. So Napoleon's soldiers starved to death. In 1905, the Germans did the same thing in Eastern Africa. The Yao and the Herero lost because the Germans burned acres and acres and acres and acres of land. And so the Africans starved. Thousands and thousands of them starved to death. And so they gave up, and the Germans won. Now, there are there are only two countries in all of Africa that were never colonized. And that's Liberia and Ethiopia. You remember Liberia? This was a country that was formed by ex-slaves from the US. And Ethiopia is a pretty cool story. So in the 1800s, somehow, there's really, I don't know how this happened, but somehow Ethiopia had kind of been overlooked by Europe, and they hadn't really gone in there. Well, the king of Ethiopia, who was King Menelik II, he looked around his country and he wanted to modernize. He wanted to modernize his country. So he paid Europeans to come into his country and help him modernize. He built schools, he built roads, he got weapons. He paid European soldiers to train his army so that he'd have a good, strong army, because this dude was really like forward thinking. And what he did was he saved his country by doing that, because they were modernized. And when Italy went to war, what? Sorry, Italy doesn't have two L's. When Italy went in to try to conquer Ethiopia, the Ethiopians fought back and they won. And it was so amazing. So once again, I know that you guys probably don't really have a concept of how big Africa is, but the entire continent of Africa is huge. There are 45 countries in Africa right now. It's gigantic. And out of all of this area, there's one country right here that wasn't conquered. Italy tried, and the Ethiopians fought them off. And teeny, 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 tiny little Liberia right here. The whole rest of the entire continent was conquered. So, gotta talk to you about the African elites. Do you remember when I told you in the last lecture that the way that England specifically liked to rule Africa was they kind of tricked the people into accepting being imperialized, because they let Africans stay in the ruling positions, but they convinced them to send all their kids to school in Europe. So these kids grew up having very European lifestyles and a European way of thinking. So when they went back to Africa, things changed. Well, when that happened, and that happened all over the continent of Africa. It wasn't just Britain. I mean, there were the rich elite class of Africans in the entire continent. Lots of them sent their kids to school in Europe. Well, when they came back, there were generally two kinds of kids that came back. One kind was completely enamored with Europe. They just loved Europe, and they were totally okay with their country being a colony of Europe because they thought Europe was perfect. And then there was another type that really did learn from Europe. They learned pride in one's country. They learned independence. They learned a respect for culture. But what they did was they used that to start nationalistic movements. Nationalistic movements in their own countries. They brought nationalism to Africa. And they tried to rally their people to rise up against their colonizers. Anti-imperialism, rise up. Let's be independent nations. We don't want to be a colony of France. We want to be an independent, insert name of country here, whatever their country was. So this is the beginning, the early, late 1800s to early 1900s began this big nationalism movement all across the continent of Africa. And it was because what the Europeans had done had kind of backfired on them. They thought they were taming the beast. They were taking these uneducated barbarian Africans and giving them a European education to appreciate the white European way. But instead, a whole bunch of them took that education and used that education to rebel and fight against the Europeans. And that brings us up to about 1914. And in case you don't remember, the lecture on Russia also ended at 1914. I'm just throwing that in there because 1914 is a big year in world history. Okay, we're all finished. I forgot to tell you where we were. This was chapter 12, section 2, in case you want to read that section. And I encourage you to read that section. Okay, bye guys.